I can hear. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Joe Grice, and I suppose today I'm sort of here as a representative of the Economic Statistics Working Group, which is the group we set up between the Royal Economic Society, the Royal Statistical Society, ONS, and indeed the Society of Professional Economists. One of our main tasks in life is to raise the profile of interesting issues in economic measurement. And actually, issues don't come much more interesting, particularly in pre-Brexit mode, than what is happening to financial flows, to financial stocks, what is happening to the finance markets in general. And notwithstanding the fact that finance markets have become incredibly important to us, particularly in the UK, but not only in the UK, I've always been a bit surprised how little development work has gone on over the last few decades to improve the statistics that we have. We are actually now, I think, though, at a very exciting time, because not only have we got continuing rapid developments of the financial markets, and of course it's 10 years since we learnt once again how important financial markets can be to all of our ordinary lives. But at the same time, we're at a point where there's a whole range of technological advances coming possible, which means that the way we look at these statistics, the way we construct them, the way we use them, is capable of transformation. And I think that's not too big a word to use. So this afternoon, we put together three presentations. The one from ONS, and my colleague Phil Davies will take us through what ONS has been doing over the last year or two to take forward this agenda. And I think in some ways will embody what I just said about the technological opportunities that are available to us at the moment as compared to what's been the case for most of my lifetime. But of course, the UK is, well, it is an island, but it's not an island in a financial sense. And actually our European colleagues also have major financial markets which are of major impact on the UK. So we thought it would also be useful to hear a little bit about what the ECB has been doing in a European context to improve financial statistics there. And not just for monetary policy purposes, but also for macro stability purposes, macro-prudential purposes, and of course, not forgetting that there's also a micro-prudential need in terms of ongoing supervision of institutions and markets, which are probably now as important as ever was. In each of those two sessions, we'll have the presentation and then time for discussion and questions, comments. We'll take a break after the second session, and you get the reward of cakes, I'm told. Probably not, I don't know, but I'm sure they're very good ones. Anyway, you certainly get the reward of something, and some tea and coffee. And then the final session, just bearing in mind that we don't put together measurements and statistics and data for the sake of it, but because it's of importance, to get a view from the Bank of England as policymaker in both the monetary policy and indeed in financial stability policy arenas. And then we'll close hopefully no later than 6:30, depending on how we get on. We might be able to close just a few minutes before that. So that's sort of what we were proposing for the order of the play this afternoon. And if everyone's happy, I'm sure we all are happy, I'll ask Phil Davies if he'd like to start us off by taking us through the ONS project on enhancing the financial accounts. Phil.
Okay, so everyone hear me? Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Joe, for the introduction. I'm Phil Davies, so I'm the head of the Financial Accounts Transformation within the ONS. I'm going to talk you through a few things today, actually. I will talk a little bit about transformation more broadly within economic statistics. I'll talk a bit about the flow of funds or the enhanced financial accounts and some of the the reasoning behind why we started this and what we've done and some of the things we did to get this off the ground. I'll talk about some of the things that we're looking towards in terms of new data sources and some of the experimental statistics that we've looked to share and to produce and what we'll do going forward. I'll talk briefly about some of the successes that I guess we've had so far, and then briefly touch on some of the future plans and maybe some of the messages that we've learned so far in terms of the work we've done already. What I would say actually is firstly, I'm the head of the area that looks after financial accounts transformation. I have a number of very hardworking people who work with me on that. So there's a series of teams beneath me, and really I'm just here representing their hard work today. So I'm very grateful for the fact that some of them are actually here in the audience. So if I get any awkward questions, I'll be looking for them for support. So just briefly, so economic statistics transformation, more broadly, what does that look like? So we have a vision for transformation. Really centers around 4 pillars, and that vision is sort of looking to be delivered within the next few years. The 4 pillars really center around rich data sources, looking at sort of capable and helpful and professional people and working with stakeholders and engaging with those that use our numbers. We also want to produce efficient systems and processes to make sure that we're getting the best use of our data for the most value. And also producing better quality analysis, so higher quality outputs, more, again, reacting to what the users want to make sure that we deliver on those 4 areas. And what I'd like to think is that the economic sort of transformation that we're doing within the flow of funds actually touches on all those 4 pillars. So I think it's a really good example of the work that we're trying to do more broadly within economic stats. So we all know that the way that we're producing our data is changing. Typically we've relied on surveys. Surveys have a very good place and still do actually in terms of what we do within the ONS. But we're moving towards a different way of collecting that data. So we are trying, there is much more data available through regulatory, through administrative, through other data sources, and we're trying to get hold of that information, to use it. Very much of the ethos is to collect the data once and use it many times. And as we go forward, I think there are more and more data streams, obviously, that we'll be able to access. We've got to keep in touch with the technology that we need to be able to access that data and the skills to be able to manipulate that. But certainly that's the direction of travel that we're taking, and we feel like we're making a good inroad into that journey. So what's the motivation for the flow of funds? I mean, I'm very grateful actually for Joe to be here today. If you think back to where we stood a few years ago, I mean, Joe was one of the instigators actually of pushing forward the flow of funds, but there were other reasons that we initially tried to get this off the ground. It's fair to say that the Bank of England, were very supportive in terms of trying to improve the financial statistics that we were producing. We've had a number of reviews within the ONS itself. So we had the Barker review of national accounts. We obviously had the review by Professor Sir Charlie Bean. But we've also had some other drivers for that. There's an international, there's an international drive by the IMF. So we've got the G20 Data Gaps Initiative and something called the Special Data Dissemination Standard, which is, again, is another tier of data sharing and data production from the IMF. But these 2 initiatives also, help sort of push the improvement of the financial accounts forward. So again, there was a whole range of very good reasons and very strong arguments to improve the financial accounts. Why is it important to the UK? Well, I mean, quite simply, amongst all the other things I've just mentioned, the UK, certainly if you look at our sort of total asset level as a proportion of nominal GDP in terms of the balance sheets, the UK has a very large proportion. So, of the 6 of the G7 economies there, it's an obvious sort of reason that we need to have important financial statistics. So, I'm pretty sure that's probably an obvious slide, but it certainly adds to the reasoning of why we need to do this. So what is the flow of funds? So this was a joint initiative. So this is not just ONS, actually. So this is us working in partnership with the bank to try and improve these accounts. We established it initially back in 2014. That's when the first seed really sort of came into being. We secured some funding sort of the following year to actually set up and go off and do some further research within the sort of the arena of the flow of funds. And one thing we did actually was go off to visit some international sort of colleagues, so just to try and learn what they were doing. So there were colleagues across some of the European countries that were already doing this sort of work, had sort of experience of starting from a position of not having that information to where they are now. So we wanted to go and learn and make sure that we understood what they were doing, some of the lessons that they learned, and make sure that we were on the right track. So what did we do? We actually went to a number of countries, including the central bank, and again, Heading's here today, but we're very grateful for the support they also gave us in the time to talk about some of the flow funds work that they were doing. But we went to Portugal, Austria, France, and Ireland actually to understand what it is they were doing. And I guess the broad message was that the initial ideas that we had within flow of funds, were on the right track. So we wanted to make sure that we had the right ideas, and I think that visit certainly cemented that vision. But what it also did was give us some further ideas and just to help us think about what it is that we wanted to achieve. So, the approach of trying to bring in record level data where we can store those in databases, link those data sets using sort of either common or sort of internationally used, whether it's ISIN or LEIs, so legal entity identifiers. So be able to link those data sets where we possibly can to be able to build up this whom matrices from the ground up. The other reassuring thing in a way was that there wasn't a one-size-fits-all. So this didn't just, there wasn't it has to be done in SAS or Excel or R or Python or some other sort of IT solution. So that gave us a bit of flexibility to look at what we could do within the confines of the ONS and how that would work. But again, the positive message was that we really sort of learned from what these guys were doing and tried to use that to help shape what we were doing going forward. So what are the enhanced financial accounts? So for us, it's about improving the quality, the coverage, and the granularity of the UK financial statistics, and crucially including this counterparty information, so this whom-to-whom element of linking both sides of the creditor and the debtor, so trying to sort of understand both parts to the transaction. Ideally, we want to try and build up from record-level data to improve the coverage and the flexibility to change, but where we can, we want to cover the entire sort of range of elements of the financial account. So that includes stock levels or balance sheets, the transactions, things like revaluations or price changes, other changes in volume, and again, this whom-to-whom element as well. Also, one important thing for us, if we can, as part of this initiative, was to look at our relationship with the rest of the world. So what can we look at beyond the UK border? What more information can we get, and are we able to use that information for greater effect? What does that look like? So this is just one element of, I guess, a sector breakdown. So what you see in blue there is what's currently published, or what was currently published, certainly at the time of the inception of this work, within the UK financial accounts. So that's the UK economic accounts, or the quarterly national accounts, and annual national accounts, or the Blue Book as it was called. We've already made some improvements to that. So this is sort of European System of Accounts 2010, sort of compliant, but we've already introduced some changes to that. So that the pink that you see there, so the further splits of some of the financial corporation sectors, and also the split of households and MPIsh, or the non-profit sort of charity sectors. So we've already done that. But probably what's powerful for me and what's the important bit here is what's in green. So that's the aspiration we have under flow of funds, is to try and actually drill down further, produce this more granular information and granular statistics that we've got within the financial statistics of the ONS. Now, this isn't just our view of the world. We've obviously gone out to stakeholders. There was a lot of engagement with the Bank of England, some of our key sort of users of the data, to understand what it is they would want to see. So, this is sort of that sort of reflected back on what we're trying to do. I think we accept, actually, that we're not going to be able to do all this, certainly not in the short term. This is aspirational, but we felt it was important to capture what we should be looking for and try and aim to hit those markers going forward. In the short term, not everything will be completed, but we thought it was a useful sort of message to try and give, that we are looking to try and change what we can do. And similarly, this isn't fixed. Part of the reason of being here today, and we've had other events where we've shared what we're doing with stakeholders and interested parties, analysts, academics, etc., is that we want your views. If you think that this is achievable or not achievable, or you have some fantastic data source that you're sitting on, preferably for free, that you can share with us, we'd love to be able to get that feedback. So, this isn't a closed book. We are trying to sort of dynamically change as we move forward, so the feedback's important. And our approach has been just that. So we've tried to really look at record level data from administrative, from regulatory, and commercial sources, really looking to try and reduce the burden on British business. This sort of mantra of collect it once and use it many times. So we're trying to, where we can, use data sources that already exist to replace the surveys that we have. In addition to that, we're looking to try and get more coverage, potentially more granularity, so that we can change the way that we react more quickly, in a sense. I think surveys are fantastic. They offer a very good way of collecting specific information. What we would like to try and do is complement that with this broader set of data that we can maybe slice and dice and react more quickly to and change when we have that different set of coverage. So it's about being able to maybe move and produce that analysis more quickly. And also, in terms of the questionnaire development, I mean, there's a time issue as well, so it's not just about the actual process, but more granularly, we want to move away from surveys where we possibly can. So there's a number of reasons why we want to try and achieve that. So just thinking now about, in terms of the context of today, we're just going to briefly talk about some of the new data sources. So I'll briefly talk about some of our surveys, some of the work we're doing on commercial data sources, I'll define what I mean by that, and also some of the work we're doing with regulatory or administrative data sources. So surveys, obviously, we survey a number of things within the ONS, clearly. I know the financial surveys are a large part of that. We've recently done some work, so as I said, we're not going to move away from surveys. We accept that. So we've done some work recently where we've already established that in the short term, certainly there are no alternative data sources. Pensions is one of those areas where we're looking to redesign and redevelop. But also the Financial Services Survey. That's a survey that we introduced into ONS a few years ago, and it's now that we're starting to see some of that data come into fruition, and we're able to use that and share that with you. And again, I'll talk a little bit about how we've shared that and our approach to experimental statistics a little bit later in the presentation. Commercially, so this is about us looking at commercial providers. So in particular, we've looked at the credit reference sort of market, if you like. So looking at data that's already collected by other companies, where we can try and get hold of that information and use that again for our purposes. And we've particularly focused on debt securities and equities, looking to sort of build that central or type of credit register, I guess. We've also had some other sort of solutions that I'll talk about on the next slide or so. And then regulatory. So, again, this is another important element of what we're trying to achieve. We are working very closely with the Bank of England, for example, on some of the data they have, and Solvency II, which is data for the insurance sort of market, is a very important part of that. Again, working with the bank, we have other sources from the Bank of England already on sort of MFIs on banks, for example. And we're also working with companies or corporations like the FCA, so the Financial Conduct Authority. We've got other sources which are more in their infancy around derivatives, and also looking at gleaning information from administrative data from HMRC, for example, as well. So we're looking across a suite of new areas for us in terms of how we could access that data. So just focusing on the commercial for a second. As I said, so what we did at the start of the project was actually go out to the commercial market to see what data they had available that we could use within the financial statistics. We focused particularly on debt securities and equities. Again, trying to sort of understand what we could use. And I think one important message, and I'll talk through the bullet in a second, but one of the really important things that we realized was, even though these companies deal in data, they weren't necessarily aware of what ONS does. And ONS was certainly, was one of the largest providers in the UK of official statistics, but yet we weren't necessarily on their radar. So we invested a huge amount of time really sharing with them what it is we're about, the public good aspect of our work, trying to sort of get them up to speed to understand the nature of what we did. And that took a huge amount of time to try and build that partnership. But we very much saw that as a really important part of the work, trying to forge that partnership, that relationship with these commercial providers. And it's important to say that we're looking to, we're not paying for data, we're paying for the service that they provide to help us understand that information. The relationships take time to forge, and that was a really sort of big learning curve for us. And the other thing is that, potentially there's a huge amount of data that we can access, but big data is difficult to structure. We were used to dealing with surveys. Moving to this environment where we have lots and lots of data was something new for us. So we've then had to upskill our sort of resources to be able to deal with big data sets, and also look at the technology that we use to access that and deal with that. So that, again, that was another important learning curve for us. And the last point is around, is the data fit for purpose? And by that I mean, we're looking at data that's not necessarily collected for statistical purposes. So we have to make sure that when we look at the data, can we actually convert that or migrate that or transform that into a data set that's useful for national accounts. National accounts has a very prescribed framework in which it works, so we have to make sure that we could use that information, and that's part of the challenge that we're going through at the moment. So just very briefly, so what we've worked with, so again, commercial data for us is about looking to either replace or complement existing surveys, potentially going back to the experience that we had with our European counterparts, look at maybe trying to develop some sort of credit register, Also think about quick wins. So look at data sets that exist already that we could maybe use to complement sources that we know to be less perfect than we'd like within the current data sources. But also tactical opportunities. So that's looking at things where we might use some of that data in the short term, but some of the long-term solutions, again, something I talk about later, about Securities database, for example, some of the long-term solutions will actually replace then some of these sort of more medium-term solutions. So there's a whole range of things that we looked at, but again, we've made some sort of strides in that area. So again, thinking about regulatory data, so again, we've taken an approach here, as you can imagine, trying to understand what data exists, again, within some of the organizations, and the Bank of England is a very good example. So they collect data on insurance for Solvency II under the sort of Prudential Regulatory Authority, and we wanted to go in and try and use that information. So the approach that we've taken is a slightly different one that we would normally do, and I'll talk a bit about that in the next few slides. But we've used the commons to try and access that data. And what's interesting, I think, is the appetite is there. I think these organizations that we work with and we partner with, absolutely want to work with the ONS in terms of what we do. But again, there are always barriers and hoops and legal sort of obstacles that we have to make sure that we can navigate. It's time consuming for that reason. Building these things, just sort of turning up and saying, right, we want access to data. That's not quite how it works. So it takes time to develop these, to develop the relationships, to develop the mechanisms that we can use to access the data. And one thing that we've also got, obviously the Digital Economy Act gives sort of the UK Stats Authority some authority and some power to access these data sources. And what we are doing is very much working on that collaborative approach, is to try and use potentially in the future where the appetite is there and we want to access data, but there are legal barriers. Hopefully the DEA will be able to allow us to overcome those barriers and share that data. But it's very much for us. We're continuing to work on the collaborative approach, making sure that we're partnering with these agencies and our stakeholders. So we also have surveys. I mean, as I said, surveys, we're trying to move away from that, but we accept that, in the short term, that's not going to be completely possible. So we do have some other surveys that I've mentioned already. Within the ONS, in terms of financial resources, we have about 24 financial surveys that we use to compile the financial accounts. And then these are ONS-driven surveys. Also, there are other sources that feed into the accounts, obviously. But these are what we do. So we have 14 quarterly, 9 annual, and there's a monthly survey also. So there is a high number of surveys that we use, but we are making strides to be able to move away from that where we possibly can. And on that, I'll talk about Solvency II in a bit more detail. So what I want to use here is the example of Solvency II, just to talk about the approach that we've taken and some of the results that we've got. So, as I mentioned, Bank of England, through the Prudential Regulatory Authority, is how we currently access the data. We have a team of people that are seconded to the bank to be able to access the data, so they work very closely with the bank colleagues to understand, to be able to look at the data and then obviously assess whether its use is viable within the national accounts. And I'd argue, if you look across Europe, we've been trailblazing the use of Solvency II. Actually, it's a complex, fairly new data set, and actually, it's something that the ONS has really worked very hard. And some of the team are here today, actually, and they've made huge strides, really at the forefront of what we're doing across Europe on this. So, it's a real sort of positive for the work that we've been doing within the teams there. And again, it's looking at the financial assets and liabilities of the UK insurance sector. Then this will hopefully replace some of our surveys. So we have 8 surveys that kind of cover some of this data source currently. We anticipate that will reduce to at least half, and that will improve over time as well. So we expect that to reduce further as the quality of the Solvency II data improves. There are some other things that we need to do within that. It's not perfect by any means, but there was an article published at the end of April which really shared some of our initial thinking, our initial data on the Solvency II sort of work that we're doing. And so on that, I'm not going to talk too much of the detail, but I just want to show you. So this is some of the results that we've had from that data set. So, we can see that it started to give us a very comparative data set to what we've got within the accounts already. The one thing it does do, and this is a technical note, but it's important, I guess, is that we now collect data, gross of reinsurance, which allows us to produce better estimates. So Solvency II has already, started to improve what we can do with this data. And it means we have also more granularity and more counterparty information. So this is, for us, is a real win. It's one of those things that the team have worked very hard to do, and it's ticked a number of boxes. So it's allowed us to take that regulatory data, reduce the surveys, and then use that within the account, and also give better, more granular information. And again, similarly, this is just the sort of, again, this is another, so that was the asset side of it. Again, we've got the liability information again, where we can now understand better the the breakdowns. It marries very well to what we had previously, so there's no huge discontinuities or changes in terms of data sources. So it's a very, we think it's a potentially a very good quality data source to use for our national accounts going forward. That said, again, great progress being made, working very hard, working very closely with the bank. So there's huge potential for this data, but there are things that we need to improve on. There are weaknesses in the data. Part of what we'll find with these regulatory data sources is that they will improve over time as quality assurance improves. And we see that here. So there are things that we need to do going forward. But again, what's been really good about the work that we've been doing, we've been able to feed that work back via the PRA, back to the regulator to be able to actually make improvements. And I know Leo and the team have been doing that already. So where we've come across issues and challenges, we've been able to feed that back for future improvements. So, hopefully this not only benefits us, but it benefits the sort of the Solvency II sort of collection, data collection more widely going forward as well. There is further work. Obviously, we've moved from some other data sources, so we've got to deal with the join potentially when we move from Solvency I to Solvency II. There are other issues in there that we need to work on, particularly about the treatment of fund managers. Technical details, but I think the message is that the potential is there, but it's not perfect. But we absolutely can use this going forward, and we will improve that as we do. What we can't use from the Solvency II, we will still collect via surveys. So we still are able to produce that really high quality data source. Something similar, but a slightly different view, and this is again as a message I really want to sort of get to at the end of this, is around. We've also been looking at what we call the EMA data set. So it's the European Market Infrastructure Regulation data set, not a very catchy title, but it looks at derivatives data. And again, we've taken the same approach here. Again, this is something that we feel like we've been trailblazing across the use of the ONS. We've had people seconded to the bank to deal with the data, again, collected through the PRA. But it's a new rich source of derivatives, so there's a huge amount of data. Again, this is a massive data source, collecting data from trade repositories sort of into one area, to look at the potential that we have for derivatives data, which is an area that we currently collect surveys from actually via the Bank of England within the ONS. And it's interesting, this has been a different challenge. So there's such a large number of observations within the data fields that just dealing with the sheer size of the volume of data has been a challenge. And again, it goes back to that message about having to change the way that we do things. There are different repositories, and the reporting requirements mean that not every company has to report the same repository. So again, we've got this mismatch. So again, the quality assurance of this data, even though it's collected under regulatory sort of PRA purposes, it's the quality is important, and I think it's that initial quality assurance where you gain massive amounts of sort of progress if you can get it sort of right at the start. We've done comparisons, and there are some discrepancies. So we don't, at this stage, there's not a great comparison to what we've got for flow of funds. There are some matches, but actually we feel that there are also a number of gaps. And when you compare to the bank survey, so it's the derivatives quarterly survey that the bank used, again, there are some differences there. So for us on this is a slightly different message in that we think this is a really important data set, but actually we might not use this in its current form, in the current time. We may not use this to primarily replace data. But what we will be able to do is use some of the rich data and information within the more granular information that we get to almost use it as a secondary use within the account. So we can actually use it to take our existing statistics and improve maybe that lower level granularity. So there's, it's still been a positive sort of journey. And I think what we will then do is obviously continue to feed in our quality assurance and our suggestions and come back to this on a regular basis to see when the quality has got to a point where we can actually use it within the account. So, again, it's been a worthwhile sort of example of what we're trying to do with different data sources, I think. The other thing we've been trying to do, and again, this goes back to some of the experiences we've had within our European sort of interviews in terms of when we went to meet with the other organizations, is that we also want to develop a securities holdings database. Again, working very closely with the Bank of England, we've been trying to establish whether the feasibility of establishing such a database, and that's about looking at issuance and holdings, bringing commercial data, potentially using existing bank data, and then potentially using regulatory data to develop this database. Now, it's still in its infancy, but again, we think there's a huge potential there to actually look at building this securities database, which would then obviously either use or replace some of the commercial data that we've looked to procure earlier on. And again, I'm very grateful. We're very much aware of the ECB model that exists. The ECB have a well-established securities database, and we've gone out and spoken to the ECB a number of times actually to try and learn from their journey, from what they've done, and that's been really helpful. And we're very grateful for their time that they've given us for that. Actually, it's really helped shape what we are thinking on what we're trying to do in the UK. But again, it's an important step forward. It's about using a different approach, the database, using different sources, and again, working with the Bank of England to try and to make that happen. So it's a movement away from just purely the surveys that we've been doing in the past. So more broadly, how we've been trying to communicate this information. So right from the outset, actually, of the flow of funds, we want to do a number of things. We've tried to do incremental delivery. We've tried to share as often and as frequent as we can in terms of some of our progress, and that might just have been just an update in terms of what we've done or what we've found, but also that would include numbers, and more recently you would have seen the Solvency II publication, which included some of the initial findings from our data sources. We had some obviously initial publication of the shadow banking sector effectively from an article that we did sort of back over the summer as well. So we're trying to share that, and that's part of the approach. We want to share often, get feedback. We're trying to share this with stakeholders and interested parties. We'd love to hear from you in terms of what you think about the results that we're seeing. Is it the right data source? Is it the wrong data source? Is it what you expect to see? And we knew, we were looking to try and improve and replace the existing surveys, but we accept that the numbers may change. And again, part of the strategy here is about having mature conversations. It's about being open and honest with what the new data sources look like. We're publishing under this experimental banner to get that feedback. So we publish alongside the normal national accounts, but it's about getting that interaction with you guys and everybody else that's interested in what we're doing. Looking slightly further ahead, what we are going to do, so we've had a number of articles, and I'll just briefly show you at the end where you can find that information, but we've had a number of articles that have been published. What we plan to do for next year is towards the sort of last quarter of next year, we will try and publish a full set of experimental statistics. So, we're moving away from that research phase of data. We're trying to take all the data that we've been evaluating and move that into a sort of an experimental set of accounts. So hopefully that'll be another opportunity for you to see the data in all its glory, I guess. Again, have that feedback interaction. What we'll then do is obviously reflect on that and look at what we've got and move more towards where we think we've got those data sources that we can put into the accounts. We move to do that within the following year or so, with a view to it being in the 2021 National Accounts publications. And again, part of this message is about, we expect things to change. These are experimental. They'll change, between now and I guess 2019. They may change between 2019 and 2021. But we'll share that with you. We're sharing what we're doing. But that's part of the journey that we're trying to get to. The other thing we've done as well is just to try and, again, as part of that communication strategy, is about trying to do things differently. So we've got a number of different visuals that we've published on the website. We update sort of the annual sort of matrices on the left-hand side here that you can see, the ribbon diagram or the Sankey diagram. So that gets updated every year to try and take on some of the new data sources or the new changes that we've got within the normal national accounts. But again, there's feedback there. If you've seen these and you use them and you like them and you think they're helpful, we'd love to hear from you. Or if you've got anything else that you'd like to, like us to try and do, again, we'd be grateful for that feedback. So just briefly, obviously this is a sort of a number of years of work so far, and we've got obviously a couple of years to go. And it feels like there's been a lot of research done, and we are just really still in that end of that research phase. But we have seen a number of improvements already. So we've made some changes to the way that we measure bonds within national accounts. You would have seen at the start of this year some improvements to the way that we communicate our pension statistics, for example. You've seen the article on Solvency II again, hopefully. Again, it's a sort of a milestone in terms of what we're trying to achieve. You would have again seen the article that links about our shadow banking data. We've tried to improve the visuals and the communication channels that we've got. And we've also been focusing on historic data. So we've also been trying to link back to the historic time series to try and sort of make that link between what we currently have and some of the longer term historic data series as well. So we know we've worked hard, we've done a lot of things, but obviously there's still a lot to do. And just a quick forward look now, really. I mean, this is really just looking at the next sort of 4 years up to 2021. We will continue to produce our experimental statistics. There will be further sort of developments around Solvency II and obviously the pensions work. We're working internationally on the IMF sort of work with the G20 data gaps. And obviously, again, some of the work that we did on the sort of shadow banking and OFI sector. I think, for me, the key message here is that, we'll continue to do this. We'll continue to take this approach. So hopefully you'll see regular publications and regular outputs from us. In 2019, you'll see the experimental stats. In 2021, hopefully that'll be fully integrated into the national accounts. But the other message, I guess, learning from what we've done already. So if you look back at our journey so far, I guess the thing for me is that obviously clearly now we can see with some of these data sets, the 4-year window is not the end of the journey. I think, things like the derivative data sets, we realize that, okay, we may not be able to use them now, but actually there's a huge potential for that data to be used going forward. And that's really the journey that we want to try and to continue after the flow of funds in its current format, if you like, is done. So we see this as very much a longer term, continuous improvement cycle where we will start to exploit more and more these new data sources and new data sets and gradually reduce the number of surveys that we collect within ONS to move to these new data sources. And very briefly, I just want to show you, so this is only from the start of last year, but these are just some of the articles that we published within the ONS, basically. So if you go onto our website and search for flow of funds, and tick the article box, you'll get a list of all the articles that we've done, but this just goes to show you some of the progress that we've been making and some of the ways in which we've communicated. I think that was it for me, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. I should have said at the outset that Phil's been instrumental in driving this project forward within ONS. I think it's probably been his main task in life, well, not necessarily in life, but in his professional life at least over the last few years. You can see an enormous amount of progress has been made, but I suppose, is it right to say that the real results will emerge when we first see the experimental statistics in their whole next year?
Yeah, I think that's the first real opportunity where we'll get to see all the data together. What we've been trying to do, as I say, Joe, we've been trying to share that as we move along, but I think 19, there's still work to do on a number of areas, so 19 will be the first time, I guess, that we try and produce this full suite of experimental statistics. So, hopefully that'll be the first real feel for what you can do with the data.
I just think this is obviously the embodiment of how doing statistics in the modern world, using the possibilities opening up of big data, administrative data, all kinds of things, clearly very applicable in this area, but actually more generally to the way we measure the economy in the UK. But comments, questions? Robert. Do you want to say you are as well? Oh, and we've got a roving microphone.
Yeah, my name is Robert Heath. I've just been appointed ONS Fellow. I previously worked in the IMF and was very involved in the G20 Data Gaps Initiative. So I think this is very encouraging. You've done a terrific amount of work. It's really good. And trying to understand the linkages between the sectors in terms of the way in which shocks work their way through the economy, understand the risks building up through the balance sheets. This is vital work. If you don't mind, I had 3 questions. One technical, 2 more specific. First of all, all these different data sets, could you give some idea how they're all going to fit together? Give an example. The securities database obviously gives you individual securities, yet you're getting surveys or you're getting information from the insurance companies and their holdings of debt securities, so maybe just a little bit of an idea, because that seems to be one of the biggest challenges. If you've got 3 different data sources, some individuals, some surveys, making sure they're all broadly consistent at least is a difficult task. Secondly was, and more specifically, are you building foreign currency into this? Because obviously the movements in the exchange rate have an impact particularly on the balance sheets as well as the financial stability of the various sectors. That's the second question, foreign currency. Thirdly was, obviously I know it's a long-term plan, but obviously the important thing often with these sort of data is the timely information. If a shock hits the economy, you want to know now, not 18 months later, how it's feeding through. What kind of time scale are you thinking? Or is a differential, some information coming quicker than others? How quickly do you expect, in the longer term, to have the information available for the policymakers? What time lag? That's the question. Yeah. Thanks.
So on the how we link data sources up, there's a number of things that we're trying to do there, I guess. We have a sort of our internal business register which links potentially companies with enterprises, etc. And so that's one aspect of what we're trying to do. We also are trying to explore the use of LEIs, so legal entity identifiers. That's another thing that we're trying to work on. From Securities' perspective, within the Bank of England, obviously they have access to some of that already, so they have LEIs and the ISA numbers, so some of that work will be done within the Bank of England, for example, and then shared with us at the aggregate level. So some of that linking will already be done for us, but it's a challenge, you're absolutely right, and this is one of the important things that we're trying to build on the LEIs. And there's work within the G20 sort of offshoots, so we're also involved in a initiative called Inexta, which is a kind of data sharing, sort of European data sharing sort of group that are trying to look at these sort of things, and that's another thing that we've looked at to try and understand what other countries are doing with the use of LEIs, to try and build up on that. So I think you're absolutely right, it's a challenge, but we have a number of avenues that we're trying to explore. On the timeliness, I'll come back to the middle question. On the timeliness, I mean, we produce statistics, obviously, in terms of our quarterly national accounts as a T+90, so everything that we're looking at has to try and fit within that model. So in the short term, typically in the life cycle of this project, I think we're looking to still meet that T+90 requirement. Going forward, actually, in terms of the flow of funds, and they might be, depending on what the data source is in terms of how we get them and whether they are, so for example, the commercial sources may not actually still meet the T+90 depending on what they do and how they do that, and there's kind of methodologies that they use to compile that, so we have to consider that when we put the data together, actually. So whether we use them to benchmark or to disaggregate at a lower level and then revise at another time, I think there's all those sorts of questions we have to think about. And sorry, the second question about the... I think, yes, we want to include that. Again, but that's something else we have to think about in terms of the challenge. It's been able to get hold of that information that we have, certainly from a securities perspective as well, so we're not quite sure. I think the bank have got sort of ideas around what we could do for that, but actually that's not something I think we can... the point you make is a challenge, actually. I think it's a difficult one for us to try and resolve, but I think where we can, we're trying to cover all that information as well, so it's certainly on the wish list.
Paul Wallace, I'm a journalist. Where is Britain in relation to complying with the IMF STDs plus initiative? That's one question. And just secondly, which is rather broad, I hope you don't mind my asking it all the same. I mean, in what concrete way, suppose we'd had this flow of funds data in 2007 or 2008, in what concrete way would that have helped people understand the risks that were being run in a way that they didn't with the data? I mean, to give you just one example, Karen Johnson, who I think used to be at the Fed, she published a paper in 2009 based on existing balance of payments financial accounts data, in which she basically blasted a hole in Bernanke's idea that it was all to do with the China issue and excess saving there, and pointing out the extent to which the European banks had this massive presence in the US, which then got further identified in BIS work. But she was just using existing data at that time.
I'll cover both questions. I'll cover the first question. I'm going to look at my colleague who's smiling at me now, only because I know some of the articles that you would have seen, actually, what we tried to do within those articles, I say Keith, who's one of the economists working here in London, has tried to actually give an example of where we could have used the flow of funds data. So if Keith doesn't mind, he may give us a sort of a brief overview of some of the work that he's done on that. With regards to STDs+, so the UK from the very start actually has been very committed to that initiative, and we are working towards our compliance with that, if you like. We are still evaluating some of the recommendations within that, within the 9 categories that we have to comply with. So we're working very much towards that, but we haven't got to a place where we can actually confirm that we can actually produce all the requirements of the STDs+. So we're still working on that, actually, but we're very much engaged with the bank, obviously, and with the IMF directly to try and understand some of those requirements and how they apply to the UK. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't. I know we're working on it. As we speak, we've had a meeting this morning where it certainly came up as a topic of discussion. So there is progress being made, but at this stage, we're not able to give that a timeline yet. I don't think we're too far away from that potentially, but at this stage, we're still waiting for some feedback actually to understand what that means for how we present that data.
Can I just give just with the risk of squeezing out questions, can I just give a personal response, Paul, to your question about what would have been different in the financial crisis? I mean, this is a personal response, but one thing that struck me as a potential answer to the Queen's question, why did no one see this was coming, was that actually very few of us were looking at the balance sheet, whether that was the balance sheet of banks or of companies or of households or, of course, the public sector. And I think one of the problems in this area is that although in principle national accounts and financial accounts have a great strength of being an integrated stock flow mechanism, far more attention in practice was given to the flows than to the stocks. So I think we got into a kind of downward spiral that no one took much interest in the financial stocks, which meant that actually the quality of them wasn't looked after very well, which meant they were scarcely worth the paper they were written on, probably to overstate the case. But nevertheless, what I hope this work is going to do is to lead to an upward spiral in terms of having well-based financial accounts, the balance sheet as well as the flows, and that we will all firmly bear that in mind when we're assessing what is going on. Now, there's lots of other reasons why we didn't see the crisis coming, but it just always struck me that that was one of them. I'm sorry, there was a question there.
Not so much a question, just to follow up from Phil's comment.
Just want to say you are, by the way.
Yeah, sorry, Keith Miller, Head of Shadow Bank in ONS. You were asking what data that we've got available now that we didn't have available 10 years ago. If you look at, say, the national accounts, the Blue Book 2017, 2018, if you look at the kind of data that we're gradually bringing in there, for example, until very recently, we didn't have investment funds separated out, S124. Starting last year, we've actually got this data separated out. Some of the articles that we've published this year, for example, for the first time we've started publishing some money market funds data. You won't find money market funds data separated out in the previous Blue Books. So we're starting to make some progress there. If you look outside of pensions, insurance and banking, and look at effectively the OFIs, if you like, all the sectors put together outside of those, for the first time now we've started publishing some data on things like securities dealers, holding companies. Again, as Phil says, if you go back to our paper of July where we put out the FSS 266 results for the first time, you will see some financial activity data there that is experimental, but it wasn't available in previous Blue Books. As Phil said, this is experimental data, but it is part of the journey that we're on.
Sorry, I don't know whether Keith wants to...
May I add something from my side? Also a personal remark, because that's maybe a difficult topic. But I have heard many, or in several speeches, statements also from policymakers that it wasn't the data that was the main problem at the time. Starting with that, perhaps I would say we have some significant issues that we solved since then. At the time, there was no data on securitization vehicles. Complete, at least for the euro area countries, I can say that that was a hole in the landscape. Asset-backed securities related to that information was lacking. What was lacking was then the main question that came up immediately after the Lehman collapse. Everybody now talking about security holding statistics uses that example. Lehman collapsed, and the question of the central banks was who holds the papers of Lehman. And it took the central banks or the supervisors 2 or 3 weeks to figure out which bank holds what. And nowadays, I think it's fair to say that the countries that have a security holding statistics can within 45 minutes find out who holds such papers. So I think that's a big difference. By the way, that also then includes information not only for the macroeconomic perspective, where we follow certain national accounts concepts, but for example also the variants where we look at banking group data. So and we can see the interconnectedness between banking groups, not between countries like we do here for the national accounts, but between banking groups across the world. So I think that there are big changes, big developments. Whether it helps to avoid the next crisis, I'm not able to say, but there have been very positive developments.
Any other thought?
Hi, Himanshi from the ONS. Thank you for the presentation, Phil. Just a very quick comment from me. So, given that we have more and more access to technology now, a considerable amount of population is moving away from the traditional financial sector and moving towards something called fintech or financial technology. And a classic example would be PayPal or other similar mediums of transactions. So my question is, now that we're moving towards big data, how will our financial service cater for these transactions that take place away or further away from the traditional financial sector? Also, that PayPal may be regulated, I'm not sure, but other mediums like that may not be as well regulated as our traditional financial sector is. So do our current financial surveys cater for these transactions, or will they in the future?
I mean, to some degree, obviously we follow the European system of accounts, so we have to sort of, certainly within national accounts, we have to follow the guidance and include what those requirements are. So that's quite a prescribed sort of set of regulations that we have to follow. I guess in terms of what you're looking at, that for me comes back to the other data sources that we know we've got to look for going forward. There are things in there that are happening, and there's more work sort of more broadly outside, I think, of the financial accounts within ONS, looking at some of these issues. But we have to include that going forward. And some of the things that we've looked at, so on commercial data, for example, there may be things in there that we can break down this granular information. So we still publish at the national accounts level, and we have that information, but there may be more granular data that we can use that will cover other things or more details, which might include that, car finance or some other things that we don't necessarily capture, but we can then use to sort of to add that granularity. So I think that for me is an exciting part of what we can do in flow of funds, is that we can actually do that going forward. There are other parts, obviously, of the national accounts that will feed into as well. So it's not just a sort of flow of funds issue, but I think there's potential for that, and we're trying to look for those sources that give us that information. Sometimes the difficulty is it's like with everything, is with commercial data, you're not necessarily sure what coverage you've got, because it's not like a survey where you can, or a regulatory source that collects everything. But we can use that, even if it's for secondary uses, where we can use it to further split existing totals or add sort of estimates for things that we don't currently capture.
I'm Keith Lai, I'm head of derivatives in Fluff Fund. So I've got one comment and a question. So just in response to Paul earlier question on sort of how different it would have been 10 years ago. I mean, from my own personal experience of working on derivatives data, I can say for certain that that data wasn't available 10 years ago, and obviously derivatives was a big thing in the last financial crisis. And now with the new EMIR data, frankly, there are some quality issues, but it's a transactional level that tells how much counterparty A is trading with counterparty B in what asset class type of derivatives, and sort of what contract type, and sort of whether it's collateralized, whether exchange traded, over the counter. So there are a lot of sort of new information out there that wasn't available 10 years ago that I think the department is looking at. In terms of a question, I was wondering, so I mean the financial system has moved on quite a lot, I think, from 10 years ago, and sort of I think there must be a question around whether the classifications that we are looking at right now still make sense. So I'm thinking about things like cryptocurrencies and sort of all these new things that are not in the account, but obviously a significant amount of money has been invested in those things, and derivatives contracts have been written, and there are exchanges for those type of things that do not fit naturally into sort of the national accounts framework. So how are we dealing with that?
I mean, certainly for us, in terms of national accounts, I guess, obviously, I mean, certainly some of the European meetings that we attend, there will at some point be a review of the ESA 2010. So I think formally that will come through those changes, obviously, as they do. And then looking at that, I think almost now, I think we're starting to have discussions around what ESA, if it's 2025, looks like, actually. I think for us, again, it comes back to that flow of funds. So if it's something that we can do within flow of funds, and we can use that, certainly initially as part of the experimental things that we do, that's one thing, and we should look to do that, if that information becomes available. For me, that's a much broader national accounts issue, though, I guess. This isn't just sort of limited to the financial accounts. So there's a whole national accounts sort of issue around, what we can collect and what we can't do, and obviously as things change, we need to keep pace with that. So I think there's a challenge between what the regulations say we can do and what we can do internally, through the lecture yourself, Keith, actually, using the economists to try and produce some of that analysis, which is helpful and informative. Before that moves into the formal national accounts. I don't know if Joe's got any further comments on that, actually, but I think it's certainly something that we're aware of, and we're trying to move towards and do that kind of analysis.
Jonathan Ather from the ONS. I think one of the things, I'm going to go back to the Bean review in terms of answering Keith's question, and also the other question about innovation here is, I think the National Accounts Framework is very valuable. It's consistent, it does that, but in many ways it's always going to be out of date, because you're always trying to codify a set of issues. It takes a few years to get that right, the world moves on. But I think very much for us, it's kind of, and I think what we're trying to do here is build a system that allows us to answer the question. You know, it's not just about populating a framework, it's having a way of organising our data that allows us to answer a question. So if a policymaker came along asking about car finance or PayPal, we would want to be able to answer that question. So I think it's a bit also about a mindset change, and that flow of funds is not just about a rigid set of financial accounts. It's about creating a set of data that can be analysed to answer any particular question. Because, you know, if there is another challenge, you know, another sort of financial issue or crisis, it's probably going to be different, and we'll probably need to answer very different questions. So I think it's that, for me, that's the mindset we need.
Okay, thanks very much. We've probably got time for one more question if anyone has anything to ask. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next session. Okay, well, in that case, let us do just that. Thank you very much, Phil. I found that fascinating. Right, as I said, we planned the second session would be on what was happening in Europe, and no one better to take us through that than Henning Annert. Henning is the head of sector account statistics at the ECB. He's actually worked in several domains of statistics, but actually most recently in monetary and financial statistics. I'm not sure if that's good to come to such a problematic area or bad, but at least it'll be interesting. Henning, please take us through what's been happening.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me, giving the opportunity to speak here. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say my English is not as fast as Phil's, so you should give me 5 extra minutes, I think. But I will try to stick to the timeline given. So I will speak about the financial accounts for the euro area, and when I say euro area, this also in some way covers all euro area countries, and some of the things are also relevant for non-euro area EU countries. I think that's fair to say. And I will speak about, in particular, 3 topics: the developments in these statistics in the recent years on the input side, the developments on the output side, what we publish, and then, and that's also a reason why I'm happy to be here and to listen to you, we are currently developing what we call a medium-term strategy. So that's about what are our plans for the next 5 years for these statistics, and we are discussing this internally and with the national central banks in Europe. So allow me to give a few 2 or 3 slides just as background about what we are doing, so that it gets maybe clearer for what the role of the ECB is. We are on the one hand involved in, let's say, setting some requirements or standards for statistical reporting, but on the other hand we are also compiling financial accounts ourselves. We do that in collaboration with all euro area national central banks. 19 is the number, the dark blue countries, and all the countries publish and compile these data, and we compile the same data for the euro area as a whole. And we also put emphasis on an issue or on a fact that we then call, by the way, there is something wrong with the formatting, that we call integrated accounts. We are not only looking at the financial account side, but we also want to make this data consistent with the non-financial accounts by sector. And actually that's something that we do in close collaboration with the colleagues in Eurostat, and the national central banks do in collaboration with the statistical institutes, and we compile the integrated accounts out of that, which we publish. So for each sector of the economy, then not only the financial but also the non-financial accounts, and as much as possible consistent. So here this slide shows the process of the compilation in a country, and then I have to see. In a country, and then what we do at the ECB in a country, and then that I don't need to explain because that is also probably a similar practice in the UK. putting all the source data together, doing the necessary alignments, doing the balancing, the integration, and then coming up with the results. That's what all euro area countries are doing, and they are sending their data to the ECB. The ECB puts all these national data together with what we call other building blocks. For example, euro area government finance statistics, euro area balance of payments, and we compile out of that our euro area accounts. EAA is the acronym that we use for that. So one may say these euro area accounts are a mixture of aggregated national statistics, aggregated national financial accounts, plus already existing euro area statistics, like the balance of payments for the euro area. So that just as a background for our work. And maybe I can also mention here that we are rather proud to say that we do this now since more or less exactly 20 years. So we have 20 years euro area statistics this year, and the financial accounts are compiled since around 15 years or 18 years. Okay, then developments on the input side for our financial accounts, and that maybe nothing is more important for the quality of the financial accounts than these developments on the data input side. Because, let's say, of course, one can always do estimates, but at the end of the day, only if we have good sources, good source statistics, we can also compile good national accounts statistics. And what I would like to highlight here without now going into detail is that over the last 20 or 18 years in the Eurosystem, we have implemented step by step really complete source statistics for almost all financial sectors. So it started really 20 years ago, and at that time we only had that statistical reporting by banks in the euro area. That was one element, and the very last one is the balance of payments. These two elements were the starting point. At the beginning we had only that. We then added also government finance, or Eurostat added government finance statistics to it. And more recent developments are then all the other financial subsectors. Data for investment funds, for financial vehicle corporations, these securitization vehicles that I mentioned before. FVC statistics, an example, they became available in 2010. Bad luck, so just 5 years too late. And now I think as the securitization markets are not anymore so dynamic, the interest has also a bit gone down. But that's a typical problem, I think, of statistics. We are reacting to developments on the market, and until we then have developed the statistics, implemented the statistics, maybe there are already some new developments. Insurance statistics, pension fund statistics, and I will also say later a few words on the security holding statistics. So all that implemented in the euro area countries, and most of these statistics, I think they can be called census-like statistics. So all entities are reporting, hardly any exemptions from reporting. I would now maybe move to, on the input side, a few major developments that were also referred to by Phil that are important or have been important for the development of our statistics. And again, sorry for the formatting. At home it looked nice. Here it doesn't look so nice. The centralized securities database. It's a big database that is a Eurosystem project, so all central banks and the ECB collaborate, and we merge their information from various commercial databases. And what this database produces is basically information on who issues what. So that's, one may say, the basis for compiling security issuance statistics for debt securities, listed shares, investment funds. Security by security for instruments that have an ISIN code, and is the basis for deriving issuance stocks and transactions. What is important, and that applies to this, but also then of other, let's say, granular data projects, which are different from the survey type of more aggregated collections, is that they require, according to our experience, a significant investment in data quality management, much more significant than maybe for some macro survey collections. So this is now a 15-year-old exercise, and I think it's fair to say we have made a lot of progress, but we are still working hard to ensure the quality and to have this database fully up and running for statistical purposes. And one statistical purpose is then that we derive from the CSDB now security issuance statistics, so not anymore collected at aggregate statistics, that each bank reports its total issuance or so, but again, ISIN by ISIN, security issuance statistics of basically everything that is issued in the euro area. And that can then be used for tailor-made aggregates that are input into macroeconomic statistics, and we will start using this one next year for the financial accounts. Then the corresponding, that was all about issuance. Now the corresponding thing on the holding side, I also already referred to before. That gives the answer to the question, who holds what? And that came, that project started really, one may say this is a baby or a result of the financial crisis. Because that information was really totally lacking in 2007 and 2008, and after that the data collection or the planning of the data collection in the ECB started. How do we collect it? Again, it's a mandatory obligatory reporting by almost all financial institutions in the euro area. They report ISIN by ISIN or whatever the asset is, the securities, and very important, of course, also the reporting of large custodians in the euro area. Similar to the CSDB that I mentioned before, it requires a lot of data quality management, a lot of work, a lot of time until this is up and running and useful, can be used for macroeconomic statistics. When this is done, it fills really a major gap in our statistics. And I think here it is fair to say that to whatever country we talk in the euro area, they all say now that in the financial accounts where there are the sectors and the instruments, for the instrument securities, debt securities, investment fund listed shares, this is now the only source. This is the main source. So from the instrument side here, this has across all sectors replaced other sources. And actually we have integrated it in the reporting of what I said before. When we have data collection from banks, we collect the balance sheet data from a bank, but for the securities we ask them to report ISIN by ISIN. This is basically the way how the macro and the micro statistics are integrated. And the biggest project currently that is ongoing is called Analytical Credit Data Sets. The short term is ANA-Credit. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Loan by loan reporting, complementing the security by security reporting. It's a big endeavor. The first reporting actually is this month. So it's far away from use for financial accounts. It may be used in 2, 3, or 4 years for financial accounts. This is again mandatory reporting of all, I think it's credit institutions plus a bit more, loans to legal entities. Does therefore not cover loans to households, but the loans to non-financial corporations, loans to other financial entities covered as far as 25,000 euro are exceeded. Phil mentioned also the commercial sources for that or other sources. We have investigated that to a large extent or in a long time also in the euro area. Our conclusion was that didn't serve our purpose. There's also one, not only commercial, some are even public, government owned or government steered projects, but they were simply also too different across countries. So one element that we need is that we have the same thing across countries. And then one country has a threshold of 10 euro, Portugal also has 10 or 20 euro as a threshold, and another country has 500,000 as a threshold. So on that basis, we were not able to compile from available credit data, credit registers, any meaningful euro area statistics. Therefore, here this data collection. And I would say currently also in the euro area from our side, the biggest project that is ongoing. And EMEA, I'm not saying much. Same challenges as that were said before. I would say this is really for future assessment. Everybody now talks about EMEA. To be honest, we still need to do a lot of work. We haven't done much with it, but clearly we also have severe gaps on the macro side for these statistics, so the potential is high. So what I would like maybe to summarize from this on the input side is that the macro parts, which are here on the left side, the survey statistics, they interact, or there is an interrelation with the more granular or micro data collections. Micro data allows us to drill down when we want to know more about the macro aggregates. They are used to compile macro aggregates, and actually we are now integrating, as I mentioned before, these granular data requirements in the surveys for macro statistics. Yeah? So banks report securities not anymore as an aggregate, but ISIN by ISIN. That was on the input side, the main developments over the last years, and what also may come in the next years. And then on the output side, and let me start maybe with the developments in the last 2 or 3 years on the output side, and I can focus there on 2. And actually I think these were the main 2, because we cannot offer every year now big new developments. But one major development, and that was also mentioned in one of the questions, referred to the timeliness of the accounts. That's now not intellectually not so interesting maybe, or very challenging, but for users, one of the main concerns of our data is this. We even had T plus 120 days until 3 or 4 years ago. Now we have T plus 90 or T plus 95. That's already much better. But is it good enough? What does it mean in practice? It means that now, today, the latest data in the financial accounts refer to end March. You can assume that when the ECB Governing Council is discussing monetary policy issues, data for end March are not of interest. So what are users doing? They build on top of our statistics what they call then their nowcasting models, additional tools. So in this way, the financial accounts build I would say, the platform or the basis, the infrastructure of many presentations. It's all organized according to SNA, or most of what our users are presenting to the Governing Council is organized according to national accounts categories. But then even with the T plus 90 timeliness, which is a big improvement, but it's certainly not yet meeting the requirements. So here the first step was therefore, or the big step was, to move from 4 months to 3 months in terms of timeliness. And the other element was mentioned before, who to whom data, so the interrelations between sectors, and this is now a simplified form that can be, we have also on the website, like the ONS, an interactive tool where one can build the who to whom graphs by selecting the sectors, by selecting the instruments, and also by selecting the countries. And with these arrows, you then see where is the money flowing, where is the credit going, or actually that's not the right term, because these are the stocks that we look at. It's not about about the flows, but about the stocks. So in this graph, for example, then one can see for the instruments, long-term debt securities, we compare the situation in, now I have to look myself. Is it Luxembourg and Italy? Yes, Luxembourg and Italy. And we only look here for simplification at 4 sectors and look for that instrument at who is issuing what and which other entities are holding it. So these who to whom statistics have been a big success, I must say. It's a lot used. It's a lot used by our users. It's also a lot used by more research-oriented people. There's a lot of work on network analysis going on. With these charts, we have, I think, a much better service for our users on the financial stability side, which are very interested in these issues. So this is the second big development in the last years. And it's also one of the items that is requested under the IMF Data Gap Initiative. And again, when we say euro area statistics, this is now available for the euro area as a whole, for all euro area countries and for almost all other European Union countries. And then finally, I can move to something more, I would like to move something that is more forward-looking and something that where I also would be interested in feedback, because we want to define the next steps in the financial accounts for the next 5 years. Why that? Because one may say that the generation of the 2014 changes are now more or less done. So when in 2014 we moved to the new ESA and the new SNA, that has now been fully implemented. The better timeliness has been implemented. The who to whom has been implemented. Some extra sector breakdowns have been implemented. And so it's time to think about where to go for the financial accounts. Also, what we have implemented in the last 3 years is more or less the result of discussions which were in 2010 or 12. So there is now really, I think, time has gone on, and the need to update the scope or the policy for the financial accounts. Perhaps I move directly to this slide here, and again, it's a little bit looks a little bit strange, but we have in this medium-term strategy we focus on 5 topics plus a few, let's say, more horizontal issues, which are not themes but more horizontal issues like integration or timeliness. But on the side of the themes, we look into 5 topics. One is globalization, the effect of globalization on national accounts, and in this case on financial accounts. Do we have enough information in the national accounts? The second is a somewhat related topic, financial accounts and balance of payments integration. I will come back on that as well. The third one, non-bank financial intermediation or credit, non-bank credit intermediation, one may also say, often called shadow banking. The fourth one on interconnectedness between sectors. And the fifth one, which is difficult to read, is distributional information from the financial accounts. So these are 5 topics that in some early discussions have, let's say, were put forward as main current themes that are discussed by users or in some cases also by statisticians. And we have the plan that by spring next year we make proposals to our highest level committee that decides about developments and to then further work on topics. I would like to say that it's for sure we will not do all that. What I'm saying, this is now about prioritizing, trying to find out what is feasible and trying to find out what is most important for users. The overall, if you sum up all what is under these items, that would be really impossible. I would like to start maybe with the item on globalization, and I think, when is it ending? I think that's the last one. So on globalization, let's say on the user side, users have woken up when Ireland published its GDP in 2015. When was it? 2015, I think so, or 2016, 2015, plus 25% growth of GDP. And then the explanations for this were, okay, a big software company reallocated intellectual property rights or patents from some places outside Europe to Ireland, and for that reason GDP increased by 25%. Then, of course, discussions, is this right or wrong? And the statisticians, after discussions, find out everything is right, and it should be like that, all in line with the national accounts. But I think the users are still a little bit lost with this type of changes in headline figures like GDP. On these kind of issues also, it's not maybe so much in the press, but it also shows up in the balance of payments. It also shows up in the financial accounts because there are financial flows and stocks related to it, equity positions, for example. And countries like Ireland, maybe one may say even this discussion is triggered by countries like Ireland, countries like Luxembourg, like the Netherlands, like Hungary, like Malta, like Cyprus, which have in their national accounts big problems with what one may call the international sector. What that international sector is differs. In some countries, it's more this SPE type of thing, or let's call it like that. In other countries, it's really that it's multinationals, which may even have also a significant production or labor in the respective country. So many different versions. And countries are, by the national account standard, obliged to stick to what the statisticians call residency principle, and that means that whatever is incorporated, and that in practice often means what is legally incorporated in a country, is reflected in the national accounts of the country. So as this is not going to change, it's under discussion, I think, for future changes of the standards. So maybe in 10 years, some conceptual decisions about this very difficult topic. The issue for now is maybe, can we or do we need more detail in the national accounts in the given framework with all the given standards that allow the users to identify it? And here the main item that comes for the sector accounts is whether one breaks down the sectors that we currently have, banks, non-financial corporations, and so on, whether one breaks down these sectors into direct investment enterprises and domestic sectors. And the direct investment enterprises are those which are owned by foreign entities. And one may then further divide by subsidiaries, those which are more than 50%, and associates, those where a single owner abroad owns more than 10%. So that would allow in the financial accounts to take the Irish financial accounts. It would clearly allow to separate the let's say, more domestically oriented transactions in the financial accounts from transactions which are mainly related to transactions of multinationals within multinational groups. And that is a bit too small now, but it can also be it has been already shown in terms of examples of how tables and data could look like. Basically the same. You would have in the columns a direct investment enterprise, direct investment sector, and you can also break down then on the instruments in the rows the respective transactions. So this is one of the items under discussion, by no means decided, would deliver very rich and new information, would also require to develop some new data sources. And closely linked to it, I keep it short, I'm not sure whether this is an issue in the UK at all, or whether the financial accounts and the balance of payments are always fully consistent. Are they? Okay. So in other European countries, this is not necessarily the case. And in the ECB, for the euro area accounts, it's not the case. Financial accounts, rest of the world sector is not the same as the balance of payments. And many countries are working on making them the same or making them more consistent, which has some implications for how the national accounts and the balance of payments are compiled. It requires really integration of these two products, which are in many countries also in two different institutions, central bank and statistical office. So more, let's say, an input-oriented issue, but one may say also a benefit for users who are then confronted with one single set of data for rest of the world in the national accounts and the balance of payments. The third topic is non-bank credit intermediation, and it was also referred to already earlier. This is this famous OFI sector, so other financial intermediaries. a sector which was until 20 years ago negligible, very small, and a sector which now, if you look in this is the presentation of total assets or total liabilities in the euro area, which has become the second largest financial sector. And if you look at a chart for Luxembourg, it's by far the largest sector, or the Netherlands. In the euro area total, it looks like that. And while I praised before so much all our very nice data collections on financial institution statistics, which is right, but we have big gaps still on this OFI sector. So we have no good sources, no euro area-wide sources to cover the OFI sector well in our statistics. The subsectors which are well covered, or the only subsector which is well covered, is the securitization vehicles, but all other entities which are in there, securities dealer, well, these are more traditional OFIs, but then also the elements like holding companies, like SBEs also. For that, the statistical coverage is still relatively thin. So if one looks at where one can make highest marginal returns in terms of quality of the subsectors in the financial sector, one would probably say this should be a priority. And for users, I think this is not only then the quality of the statistics, but as we all know, there's a lot of discussion on shadow banking and the role of these entities. And I think in the later presentation also that there will be reference to this. Interconnectedness, I mentioned before, is basically the who to whom topic that I mentioned before. And one may say here that this has maybe two dimensions. One is more detail to what we already have. So for example, when we look at this OFI sector, to be able to have also the interconnectedness between OFIs within the OFI sector in the accounts. The other element that we are discussing here is this, what statisticians call look-through approach. That the issue with our statistics, or one of the features of the statistics, is that when we look at the exposure of certain sectors in the accounts, we see, I mean, who has issued the paper. Now I have to make sure that I'm not getting lost. I mean, it's the look-through, who is the ultimate holder of a certain instrument. Yeah, that is the purpose of the whole exercise. Maybe I leave it with that. Because we, for example, now know that a household holds investment funds. We know that a household holds a Luxembourgish investment fund, which is an equity fund. But we do not know, we do not look through what the household therefore actually holds in terms of debt securities or equity, and where the equities have been issued, what currencies the equities have. So we only see the intermediate step, households or insurance companies holding investment funds, but we do not actually see the ultimate exposure that is there. So these are the two topics that are under the framework interconnectedness. And the last topic that we have on the list as themes is distributional information. I believe the ONS is also working on this. Also on the international agenda of G20 Data Gap Initiative, very relevant. Traditionally, distributional information has, of course, by definition in the macro statistics, not played a significant role. The household sector was one sector. The euro area household sector covers 120 million households, and they are all very different. But we only have one number. And this has become, like many issues for our data, more prominent in the financial crisis. Distributional effects of the financial crisis, distributional effects of the monetary policy in the financial crisis, credibility, acceptance of monetary policy decisions may also depend on the degree of equality or inequality in a country. And if one looks at wealth, one finds out that certain financial instruments are held only by a very small share of the household sector. Some financial instruments are held only by 1, 2, or 5% of the household sector, so these participation rates are very small. And even if one looks at volumes, at numbers, like the left chart here, which is just an illustration, very often shows, this is here the debt distribution is maybe often very skewed. So the challenge here is macro statistics have no information on distributional data. We get it, or we take data from household surveys. So interviewers going to a household and asking them about what do you own, what is your debt, what are your deposits, and then one tries to connect this data with the national accounts. The biggest challenge is that if you gross up the household survey to a country total, the totals which come out are far below any national accounts numbers, because all households are significantly, not all, but in some, the households are significantly underreporting their holdings of financial instruments, and their, also to some extent, their debt and their real estate ownership. And one may assume, or one may guess, that this error, or this gap that is there, is not proportionally distributed now, or equally distributed between different household types, but that maybe, for example, wealthy households have an incentive not to give the fully, let's say, the full information on their wealth. So, I think interesting data, an interesting field for development of the financial accounts would bring us also closer to a new user group. The traditional monetary policy experts in the ECB are not so keen on this information, is my impression. For them, it's enough if they have every 2 years maybe a research paper or a research study on this topic. But say for other economic analysis and for financial stability and for the public at large, I think this is an interesting development. So these were the 5 topics that I wanted to mention, and then I also would like to finally mention that, of course, when we look ahead for the financial accounts, when we look ahead for the financial accounts, the IMF and the G20 Data Gap Initiative has a long list of improvements for the financial accounts, which are prioritized a bit by target items and encouraged items. But this is really already a very significant list. So any development, any further development of the financial accounts, of course, also must take into account this, because one countries and the ECB and everybody, I think, we cannot develop in all directions, but we have to have one consistent development path for the financial accounts, and the data gap recommendations for more instrument breakdown, for more sector breakdowns are certainly very important in this context, and we will take them into account. If one takes all that together, and that's maybe the second, almost the last slide, one comes also to something that we call the integration pyramid for financial accounts. Looking at all these new dimensions, one potentially ends up with an extremely complex system of instruments and sectors and subsectors, and then some people want to further break down by residual maturity and original maturity, and maybe by currency and so on. And these are not individual independent numbers, but they all need to be developed in an integrated framework, with who-to-whom data fully integrated. Possibly we want to integrate with the balance of payments, we want to integrate with the non-financial accounts, and we want to publish, if possible, earlier than T+90. So that sounds all quite challenging. And where we are currently on the ECB side with the compilation of the financial accounts, we are in the very top of this consistency triangle there. So currently all our accounts are fully consistent. everything is integrated, who-to-whom data fully integrated. But when, in case we go for much more detail, much more granularity in the financial accounts, there is then maybe also an issue that one may have, some people call it more satellite accounts, or some people call it memo items, or less integrated or semi-integrated items in the accounts, because all this becomes a very complex endeavor. And we have, for example, for the quarterly production of the accounts, we have 3 to 5 working days. So this is not very much, and one cannot add all requirements, all details, and then full consistency requirements at the same time. So we also look at that. So finally, the conclusions. We have, for our financial accounts, we believe that the core is the good basis of the financial sector statistics. Except with this exception of the OFI sector, other financial sectors fully covered. Sector, and now with security and loans also main instruments. These new granular data offer great opportunities for financial accounts when and provided and if they are well designed and well established after a lot of several years of work. They provide good quality input for the macroeconomic statistics and give us a lot of room for development and flexibility. In the last 3 years, the main improvements were better timeliness and the who-to-whom data. And for the medium-term strategy, I mentioned the main topics. But again, I would like to highlight this is for discussion, and we will probably then set priorities by going in, or by choosing 1 or 2 main projects for the next years. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've got about 15, 20 minutes. Questions or comments?
Sorry, yes. Paul Wallace. I just wonder whether you could tell us whether the taking over of supervisory functions by the ECB through the SSM is playing any role in compiling your figures. And then if you could perhaps cast more light on how you deal with the Irish problem, that's that slide you put up. And I think, how do you get round also the question of who ultimately owns the assets in Ireland? So correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, when one thinks about the multinational presence there, it's primarily American. That's what you see when you're in Dublin, or if you go to Cork. But if you look at the national accounts, if you look at the balance of payments figures, you'll find that you wouldn't conclude from that the owners were American, because it will be the immediate owner, which could be based in Luxembourg or the Netherlands. So you need it's a bit like the BIS consolidated accounts, where you get the ultimate owner or the ultimate creditor. Is it possible to get this information?
On the last question, if there are any balance of payments experts in the room, I would appreciate help. Is it possible to identify the ultimate owner? In the financial accounts, I can tell you it's not possible, for sure, it's not possible. Now the balance of payments have additional breakdowns in the data. I would have to check whether it's possible. I doubt it that it's possible. I don't know whether you maybe know, or Robert?
The BIS measures it through the banking sector, and they, of course, the guarantees of the parent bank, and that's the way in which they measure ultimate risk. In other words, what they try and do is, if you have an American bank in Europe, they will allocate the risk back to the American parent in the US, and so forth and so on, by country, so you can see which countries are net guarantors and which countries are taking the guarantees. Generally, I mean, ultimate risk has been very difficult to measure. Trying to work your way through the chain, because often it may not just be the first level, it may be the next level is a problem. I was actually going to ask a similar question. I mean, I wondered, going back to your earlier point, whether you can compare the data you get from the financial accounts with the data the ECB is now getting from the supervisory side to see the extent to which there may be risk being allocated to European banks which are not covered through the sectoral accounts data.
Now that question I can certainly answer. The supervisory statistics are collected for supervisory purposes. In the ECB, the arrangement is for macroeconomic statistics, we don't see the data. So there is no link, no communication between the collection of, this is FinRep and CoRep data for supervisory purposes, and macroeconomic statistical production. There are Chinese walls. The division which works on supervisory statistics is separated from any macroeconomic statistics. So therefore, there is no way. One may say this is maybe not the most efficient way to do statistics. One may think about different arrangements, but the current legal provisions are the ones as I described them. So the supervisory statistics are for supervisory purposes. Like the whole banking supervision is in the ECB totally separated from monetary policy considerations.
Yeah, I had a couple of other questions actually. Going back to the point you just say, that's what surprised me a little bit about the ONS presentation, saying they were using supervisory data. Yeah, you obviously have a different approach between the two. And what concerned me a little bit was supervisory is often on different definitions to the national accounts data. But don't want to get too much into that.
The
But it's
underlying
interesting
philosophy
there's a different approach.
with the ONS approach is that there are different purposes. There's monetary policy, there's clearly macro-prudential policy, there's micro supervisory issues. Clearly, the access that people have to that data is different in each case. On the other hand, even if there are different purposes, there ought to be, in one sense, an underlying reality. There is only one real world, and the data that we have for supervisory purposes shouldn't be different, optimally, from the data that we have for monetary policy purposes. Now, clearly, in practice, there are all kinds of issues of confidentiality and security that have to be worked through and broken down, and not surprisingly, people take them very seriously. But I think our fundamental approach is that we want to have one underlying source, which is the real world, however you break that down for whatever policy purpose you have in mind. But easier said than done, of course.
I should maybe add that we also, for example, use, like you, Solvency II data for insurance statistics, but that is about getting for a country an aggregate that is derived from microdata on Solvency II. I understood your question like, can we use information on an entity-by-entity basis for enhancing our macroeconomic statistics and analysis? And that we cannot do. Yeah. What is done, and the BIS locational banking statistics, for example, or the BIS banking statistics make use of it, that when supervisory data is aggregated for countries and you cannot identify anymore the individual banks behind it, then there are also ways to use it for statistical purposes.
Can I ask down two other questions? One was a comment, really, or a question. You mentioned about, say, the securities database and the credit database to be in terms of its contribution to the financial accounts. But my understanding was again, I'm coming back to timeliness. Mm-hmm. Those, like security database, you can actually use the data far quicker than putting it into the national accounts. Is that correct? You know, that in other words, you get data on securities so quickly relative to the 90 days that can actually be used by policymakers faster than including it in the financial accounts. The second question was a very specific one, actually. related to your security database. It was interesting that very, very comprehensive coverage, but it was interesting, if I understood it correctly, issues by the rest of the world which were not in euros were not covered by the database. So in other words, if a pension fund invested in the US or China or Brazil, that wouldn't be covered by the securities database. Where do you get that information from? Is that from the IMF coordinated survey?
So on the first question, the timeliness, where does the granular data improve the timeliness? In the case of securities, there is a massive improvement as regards the security issuance, because this data comes from market sources. So you have 5 days after the end of the month, you have the information. So, but that's about security issuance, about the outstanding amounts of securities, and if that is then linked with the necessary other databases, you can, what one did before after 2 months, you can now do if you want, and if the quality is good, then you can do it after a week. It's different for security holdings, because there again you have surveys of entities which report security by security on their holdings. You cannot obtain that improvement of timeliness, but you still can reach, let's say, objectives like T+30 or T+40 are fairly realistic. So yes, you are right. That is one of the big advantages of this security reporting. On your last point, again, it depends on, are you referring to security issuance or security holdings? The non-euro. So that is the CSDB.
Go forward. And the next one, I think.
Oh, that's holdings?
Yeah, yes. So, sorry, you see, you have issued by the rest of the world, high assets, euro denominated. So let's suppose a pension fund was holding US securities in dollars or Chinese securities in renminbi. Would that be captured through? It must be captured through a different method, because
that's a good question. I would rather think that maybe here there's a small mistake in the slide. It's probably that let's say we convert all foreign currency issuance into euro. They are collected. Sorry for that. Yes, they are collected. If they are held by euro area reporting entities, they are reported. Yes, it would make a little sense. Yes.
My name is Leonidas Akritidis. I'm ONS, currently seconded to the Bank of England to deal with Solvency II, among others. And in my previous life, I was working with Henning on the other side at Eurostat. Just to answer one of the questions Robert asked about how we use regulatory data for the purpose to compile national accounts, financial accounts within the national accounts. Well, given that the regulatory data, in this case Solvency II, is relatively well structured, it has its own standards. What we do, we build bridge tables in order to translate the standards within Solvency II in this regulatory data, and you bridge them into instruments as required by the national account standards. You bridge allocation of entities into the institutional sectors as required by national accounts. And you do other manipulation in order to bridge from one standard to another. So it's not really a rocket science. ECB was very good in cooperating with EIOPA, who is regulating Solvency II, to introduce additional variables there. Unfortunately, UK doesn't follow this. So we had a more exciting job to do. But it was possible and the job was done. So we can use Solvency II as one example of regulatory data. And now I have 2 questions, or 3 if I may, very quickly. I think the issue of identifying the ultimate holder is always a problem. So the question that I would have, how easy, because you also admitted that it's not straightforward, and how statistically valuable is the information that you produced right now, given that you have difficulties identifying the ultimate holder. So this is my first question. I could go, into the detail with respect to what source data you use in order to ensure how accurate the information is, but you know this very well, so I will leave the freedom to you to answer this. My second question is related that you rely heavily on ISIN identification of securities, so security by security. I understand that this helps you to bridge the holders with the issuers, so CSTB with the SHS. But what if you have securities which are traded outside the official stock exchanges? And I'm not referring only to corporate shares. I'm also referring that there are certain debt securities which are traded outside. So how you think important is this part of the market? And my final question refers to something that I like very much. You mentioned the look-through approach with respect to investment funds. We are currently also looking into this aspect from the insurers, UK insurers' perspective. Although this goes beyond national accounts requirements, if you like, I'm really enthusiastic to go in depth to see what is the composition of the investment funds, shares or units. So I would like to ask a question, how advanced you are in this work, and how do you link this, because from user perspective this is very important, but how do you link this with the presentation of the financial accounts within the national accounts?
Can you just, the last question, can you say it again? I didn't
The look-through approach. Yeah. So, in other words, if you have an insurance corporation that buys an investment fund share, a hedge fund, for example, a share. So, from the perspective of national accounts, what you see, you have a holder being the insurance corporation and the liable sector being the investment fund vehicle, which could be a vehicle resident in the UK. But what is here important, it is to see the composition of this share, what it is inside. So you undress, if you like, the share and you see, okay, inside I see there are corporate shares purchased from the US. There are bonds that essentially have been issued in China. So my question is, how do you link this look-through approach to the financial accounts?
Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe to start with a question on, if I got it right, the first one on, which was also linked to the look-through approach. Basically, I think this idea of a look-through approach becomes more and more important, when more and more financial investors use funds to, let's say, invest their money. And it's nowadays not anymore only that the household sector buys investment funds or that banks buy investment funds, but that insurance corporations and pension funds are outsourcing entirely, if I may call it like that, the asset management which they have by investing directly in investment funds, rather than maybe 20 years before they had an own, let's say, asset management within the insurance. So therefore this look-through becomes more and more important. The question on the ISIN, what to do with the non-ISIN, if that was the question, the part of unlisted shares without ISIN is in the euro area very small. So that is we have there a non-coverage issue of something like 5% of the total market. So that's in itself not a tremendous problem. The, let's say, international accounts definition, then the other element for which we will never have anything like that is the position on other equity. is much bigger, and where any kind of this item-by-item reporting, of course, is not possible. On the last question, I still struggle to understand what actually the question was on the look through how we implement that. I think the difficulty is that what I see as a challenge, we know very well what the Luxembourgish Investment Fund invests in. And we know very well that a household owns, and that's what our statistics say, own, for example, an equity fund, or own, for example, a bond fund. But we have difficulties to make the link between this granular information of what the Luxembourgish Investment Fund invests in and the more aggregated information that we have that the household sector owns an equity fund or owns a bond fund, but we do not know which fund. And that's where additional data is needed to make the look-through approach working, to bridge this gap between the micro data on the fund and the semi-aggregated data for the household sector. That's one of the challenges.
Okay, I get the impression that maybe one or two unfinished conversations, but maybe the sensible thing now would be to finish. So we finish this session so that we stay more or less on schedule. And of course, by all means, let's continue these conversations. But I think the refreshments are where we started off. And if we could resume, just a little bit over time, but if we can resume at 5:25, then we'll stick to our schedule and hopefully also have time for the cake and biscuits. So thank you very much indeed, Henning. That was just starting. Now on to the last lap, I'm sure the best lap. And to deliver the best lap, Stephen Donkins from the Bank of England is going to take us through. Stephen's part of the Bank of England's Financial Stability Directorate and also a member of the Financial Stability Board's Shadow Banking Experts Group, no less. But at all events, given that all of this activity we've been talking about is to improve decision-making or to help decision-making, it seemed good to get a perspective on the way the Bank of England uses this information for policy purposes. So, Stephen, if I may.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Joe said, my name is Steve Dodkins. I'm part of the bank's Financial Stability Directorate, specifically in the Capital Markets Division. So my aim today is to give you a user's perspective of the flow of funds, the enhanced national accounts, how we use them in particular for monitoring financial stability. I'll focus on non-banks and also talk about how we use this both domestically with the FPC, but also globally with the Financial Stability Board as well. And then in the second half of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about a kind of a new model that the bank is developing on a system-wide stress simulation, which will be another use for this enhanced flow of funds data in the future. So just by kind of way of context and introduction, we've seen kind of the impacts on the economy from financial instability. Even now, 10 years on from the crisis, we can see that kind of UK GDP is significantly lower than what it might have been were it not for the crisis. So the experiences of the crisis led to the then government reforming kind of the regulatory architecture and framework around financial services in the UK. So financial stability is one of the Bank of England's two objectives alongside monetary stability. And following the crisis, the FPC, so the Financial Policy Committee, was introduced by the government to protect and enhance the resilience of the UK financial system. So specifically, the FPC is tasked with looking at the system as a whole, not just kind of not individual firms, but the system as a whole. So this kind of, I guess, fills one of the gaps that people thought existed prior to the crisis, where, individual regulators were looking at firms, but no one was really taking account of the vulnerabilities in the system as a whole. So the FPC also has a secondary objective to support the government's economic growth policies.
but that is very much a secondary objective after kind of this objective of enhancing the resilience of the system. Another change following the crisis was the creation of the PRA within the Bank of England, so the Prudential Regulation Authority, and at the top of the PRA is now the Prudential Regulation Committee, which looks at individual firms. So they supervise individual banks and insurance companies, and also some of the largest investment firms. So having these two committees within the bank really increases kind of cooperation. There's a significant overlap in terms of kind of the committee memberships. So both committees are chaired by the governor. So this just really supports kind of the oversight of the financial system and ensures that there are no gaps existing. So the FPC, immediately after the crisis, a lot of its kind of focus was on increasing the resilience of the banks. They did a lot to kind of build capital, so the amount that banks hold themselves to be able to withstand losses. And since then, it's continued to strengthen the banks, but also look elsewhere, so looking at household indebtedness. If you've seen the recent financial stability reports, you'll see that there's more focus on things such as cyber vulnerabilities, and you won't be surprised to hear that the FPC is also spending a lot of time thinking about Brexit as well, and kind of potential kind of worst case scenarios and how to ensure that the financial system continues running to support the economy in whatever circumstance. So alongside those kind of near-term priorities, the FPC has also set some medium-term priorities. So this is one of them. So completing post-crisis reforms to market-based finance in the UK and improving the assessment of systemic risks across the financial system. So like I said, the FPC is responsible for the system as a whole. It's not just looking at big banks or anything like that. It is really looking at the system as a whole. In doing this, it does an annual review of activities kind of outside the regular banking sector. And this is kind of one of the purposes of this annual review is to consider whether there are changes needed to regulation. So changes kind of with how things are regulated inside the so-called regulatory perimeter, or whether there are unregulated activities that need to be brought inside kind of bank supervision or FCA supervision. Another part of this medium-term priority is to support the bank's work to develop a system-wide stress simulation. And so this is what I'll go on to talk about a bit more in the second half of my presentation. And all this work supports kind of decisions on whether there are specific macroprudential tools that are needed for non-banks and market-based finance. So in terms of kind of the UK financial system, non-bank finance is big and is growing. It's becoming increasingly important as part of the financial system. So these grey bars just show kind of the total assets of banks. So it's around 12 trillion, but then we can add on insurance companies and pension funds. So I think this is another £4.5 trillion. And then finally these other financial institutions, so the OFI or OFI sector, which we've talked about previously in the other presentations. So historically, this large pink section is the area where we haven't been able to have a more granular breakdown by entity type within the financial accounts. So it's around a quarter of the financial system. But together, non-banks, so adding in insurance and corporations and pension funds, together it accounts for around a half of the financial system. And you can see from the orange line that it's been growing over time in recent years since the crisis. So this is in part due to kind of the growth of investment funds and things. And this is not just kind of the case at the UK level, but it's important globally as well. This box just shows, again, the similar breakdown for the global financial system. So this is a chart from the FSB's shadow banking report. So the Financial Stability Board, the FSB, is a collection of mainly central banks and market regulators, mainly from the G20 countries. But to kind of fill data gaps, it also includes other jurisdictions such as Ireland and the Cayman Islands. So these kind of smaller countries that are kind of important centres for funds in the financial system. So we can see, again, from this box that non-banks together, they're around half of the financial system. And the UK is an important part of that. So the pie chart just shows the OFI assets split by jurisdiction. So the UK is one of the largest jurisdictions. Within the euro area, which is the large kind of dark green segment. So that includes kind of Luxembourg and Ireland, which we mentioned earlier. These are, again, important domiciles for investment funds in particular, but also for kind of the multinationals and the captive financial institutions, the holding companies that that Henning talked about. So the FSB kind of leads this monitoring at the global level. And it has kind of a two-pronged approach to monitoring. So this is in relation to shadow banking, and it would define shadow banking as non-bank credit intermediation. So these two prongs, the first is to establish system-wide monitoring frameworks at national and global levels. So at the global level, this it comes out each year in the annual shadow banking report, which is, like I say, it's a collection of different regulators that input data and allows us to kind of assess trends globally. And then considering kind of the output of this monitoring and kind of what it shows, the FSB also considers policy measures and whether further action is needed to strengthen the oversight and regulation of certain activities. So, for example, last year the FSB issued a set of recommendations related to asset management, vulnerabilities in asset management and investment funds. So, for example, due to liquidity mismatch or leverage. And these recommendations are being implemented and kind of operationalized at the moment. So as part of the FSB's monitoring framework, it produces what it terms as a narrow measure of shadow banking. So this narrow measure is comprised of 5 economic functions, so 5 kind of activities that are related to various different risks. So the table on the right-hand side just kind of sets out what some of these economic functions are. So there's 5 of them. So, for example, economic function 1 is the management of collective investment vehicles susceptible to runs. For example, fixed income funds or money market funds. So funds where investors may be tempted to withdraw en masse if they think that the fund may make a loss and may have insufficient liquid assets or cash to be able to pay out redemptions. And you can see from the chart on the left-hand side that this economic function 1, so the kind of the pink bar on the top, is really what's driven the growth of this narrow measure of shadow banking since 2011. Everything else, so economic function 2 to 4, has stayed pretty much flat. So these are global measures. And those other economic functions, so 2 to 5, sorry, they're ones that tend to be more associated with the financial crisis. If we were to take this chart back a bit further, you can see how they were larger and they've declined since kind of 2008. These are kind of the things that I think the governor had previously referred to as kind of the more toxic parts of shadow banking. So we've seen the decline in those things, but have seen a growth of asset management since then. So just to explain a bit how we get to this narrow measure for the UK. So this chart kind of shows our data from the 2017 exercise, so using 2016 data. So first, moving from left to right, we start with by considering all non-bank entities, so insurance companies, pension funds, OFIs. And then we decide, based on those economic functions, kind of what entities fall outside of those economic functions. So, for example, most pension funds and insurance companies fall outside. After that, the next stage is to consider which entities are actually part of a banking group. So there could be kind of subsidiaries or legal entities within this OP sector that are actually kind of part of a banking group. So say a non-deposit taking entity of HSBC or Barclays is actually part of kind of the Barclays or HSBC group. So where this is the case, and these firms are subject to kind of supervision at the group level and to capital requirements and things like that, then we exclude them from this shadow banking measure. For the UK specifically, this is quite large, and this relates mainly to investment firms, so kind of the large investment banks that are supervised by the PRA. And then the final stage, the shadow banking number is kind of things that are definitely inside those 5 economic functions. So investment, fixed income, investment funds, and things like that. But there is a gap between kind of what we're left with after this third column and the fifth column of what's definitely outside and what's definitely in. In the past, we've had this, what we termed this OFI residual. And this is essentially the difference between kind of our bottom-up estimates of different subsectors within the OFI sector and kind of the overall OFI number that is published by the ONS. So in the past, we've had a residual here, and you can see in kind of 2016, this was, compared to the size of shadow banking, it was quite sizable, quite significant. So this is a concern from financial stability monitoring purposes, because we don't necessarily know what this OFI residual contains. You know, what risks could be hidden or masked by these numbers. So it's a priority for us to kind of try and close this gap and fill this residual, just so we have a better understanding of risks within the financial system. So together with the ONS and the FCA, we've been making improvements in this area recently. This is part of the Enhanced Financial Accounts Flow of Funds project that Bill spoke about in the first presentation. So a lot of good work has been going on to improve our understanding of the OFI sector. So the chart on the left-hand the left-hand side of the slide just shows kind of the size of investment funds within the OFI sector. So this is something that the ONS published for the first time last year, separating out investment funds from the OFI sector in the Blue Book. So that we can see they account for almost a quarter of the OFI assets. And then on the right-hand side is are some numbers from experimental statistics that have been published by the ONS this summer. So these are experimental statistics that are subject to change, but at the moment, there's something that give us have really helped to increase our understanding of the OFI sector. It's the first time we've had kind of this granular breakdown of the OFI sector, so it is useful in increasing our understanding. So these are entities within the ONS's financial sector survey. So the top bar, security dealing on own account, that's essentially the large broker-dealers of investment firms, mainly that are supervised by the PRA. But we can see from this data that holding companies, so I've just grayed out the other entities, we can see holding companies form a substantial part of the financial system within the OFI sector. So this is important for us because this is something that we've really struggled to get data on before. And these are firms that are not necessarily supervised by the FCA or by the PRA and things, so it's important that we can get this data to try and understand the risks a bit more. So this is a useful addition, and then as we kind of go through the project and continue to enhance the flow of funds, these data will be refined and fully incorporated into kind of the Blue Book and things, which will really help our understanding. So in terms of what we as the Bank of England need from flow of funds, I think we're always after more granular data, and this always helps with kind of the FPC's annual assessment of risk beyond the core banking sector. We want to try and assess risks and interlinkages both within and outside the OFI sector. It helps to be able to fulfill our kind of commitments to the FSB, submitting data for the annual shadow banking exercise, which really helps kind of provide evidence for different policies at a global level. And ultimately, it improves kind of the evidence base for any kind of policies here domestically that the FPC might wish to employ. So in terms of what the flow of funds might look like in 2021, so Phil showed a chart earlier with a kind of granular breakdown of kind of what the full version of the flow of funds should look like. So my version is more kind of a stylized, mainly to kind of fit it into the charts. It's not necessarily kind of the exact sectors, but I just want to kind of illustrate kind of how we're going to have more granular data in the future. So this is what we've had previously, just kind of the sector as a whole. And then last year we've separated out non-money market fund investment funds, and then from that you can separate out the other financial intermediaries. But in the future, we hope to break these funds down further, for example, open and closed-ended funds, and then different types, and then also by asset class, so whether they're equity or fixed income or other funds as well. And then with the other financial intermediaries, also kind of break them down into different entity types as well. So this is kind of a stylized example of what it might look like in 2021. But you can see just much more granular data, which will really help our risk assessment. So just to kind of summarize the first part of my presentation, so flow of funds are useful for the bank in assessing financial stability risks, but there's still room for improvement. We're making progress, but we're still on the way to kind of getting more granularity, and further breakdowns of sectors and instruments. But yeah, like I say, we're making good progress, and this is something that will become increasingly more useful, particularly as we've seen how the non-bank sector has been growing. So just for the second part of my presentation, I just want to talk about another kind of use of flow of funds data, and this is more what we hope to be able to use flow of funds for in the future. So this is a model that the bank is developing on a system-wide stress simulation. So we saw earlier one of the FPC's medium-term priorities is to improve assessment of risk across the whole system, and this is one aspect of that. So I'll just explain the model briefly, talk about some of the data needs and how kind of the flow of funds data might help. This isn't something I've been working on closely, so I'll do the best I can to explain it, but I'll probably go through it at quite a high level. So this chart we've seen before earlier in the presentation, just to remind you about kind of the size and importance of the non-bank sector within the UK, and how it has been growing and is becoming increasingly important. So some of the key questions that we want to know, and we're hoping to answer through this model, is how resilient is the whole system to different shocks, and how do non-banks transmit shocks to banks? So we need models that capture both the diversity and interconnectedness of the whole system. So to do this, we're developing what we term this MARS model. So MARS stands for multi-agent risk simulation. And this model does various things. So it captures the interaction of diverse behaviors and constraints. So the behaviors of different sectors, different agents within the economy, and also constraints. These could be policy constraints such as leverage ratios and things like that. There are multiple contagion channels. I'll go on to explain these in a minute. And it is a general equilibrium framework. So the amount kind of demand equals supply, and the amount of assets that are kind of purchased equals the amount sold by other agents in the model. So in terms of kind of inputs and things we can ask the model about, so there'll always be a shock to move from the initial equilibrium. I'll come on to explain what some of those shocks might be, but we can also kind of tweak and adjust different things such as vulnerabilities or policies, so different kind of leverage constraints or like leverage ratios and things like that we can adjust and see how that impacts the model. And then what it will tell us about is kind of the impact of stress, so if there is a shock to the system, sources of amplification, and also tipping points as well, so whether small changes in particular constraints can lead to the large differences in the output. So just to explain the model structure, so there are three kind of securities markets within the model. So a corporate bond market, a government bond market, and equity markets. There's also a funding market. So this is kind of like a stylized funding market with a repo market, so repurchase agreements, which are backed by government securities. And there's also a derivatives market for interest rate swaps. In terms of the agents within the model, so there's 7 different agents, and these fulfill different roles. So the pension fund, the insurance company, the investment fund, they're all pretty much long-term investors. They aim to kind of maximize a risk-adjusted rate of return. We've got a hedge fund, which is a short-term investor and aims to kind of profit between divergences between kind of fundamental values of assets and the market price. We've got cash providers in the form of a money market fund and a commercial bank. And there's also a dealer that is an intermediary for the repo and derivatives markets. So just to go on to some of the contagion channels. So the first one is through common asset holdings. So as there's a shock or a change in kind of the expected rate of return on some of these assets, the different agents will have different kind of desires to either buy more or sell more assets. So this has impacts within the model. There's also impacts or contagion channels through the funding channel. For example, the money market fund, if it is subject to redemptions from its investors, then the money market fund will provide less funding on the repo market, which might mean that the pension fund or the hedge fund have to delever and to sell assets. And on the derivatives market, there is scope for margin calls there, which, again, this was kind of an important part of the financial crisis, so it's something that we want to capture within the model. So in terms of how the model kind of flows, so there are 4 buckets of variables that we can shock. So these are, the first one is expected returns on the traded assets, so on the government bond or the corporate bond or the equity. The second is the price of non-traded assets. So for example, there could be a shock to the commercial bank's loan book, and that's the non-traded asset, which might impact its behavior. Household behaviors, so there could be things such as redemptions from investment funds, which would have impacts on the model, and we can also vary regulations or constraints. So for example, leverage ratios and things like that. And then the model works as follows. So it starts off at an initial equilibrium. There is then the shock to the system. The different agents react to the shock, and then the model kind of computes and calculates supply and demand across the various markets and the funding markets. And this is kind of an iterative process until the market's clear and kind of supply equals demand, and there's a new equilibrium, so that no one has a desire to buy or to sell anymore. And just how the model is kind of calibrated and how we think about the model, we kind of envision this as kind of roughly taking place over a month. That's kind of the time span that we have in mind. So in terms of the results that we can get from the model, so we can look at changes in asset prices, and you can look at those that are kind of well, you can kind of split these into 2 different things. So kind of the unconstrained market prices, but then how market prices change when kind of particular constraints, such as leverage ratios, is kind of the one example, but it just forces agents to act in a particular way. So you can look which agents buy and sell and how much, and which constraints drive behavior. So this is important for future research, and also kind of the tipping points that I mentioned earlier, to kind of understand how these small changes can have big impacts on the system as a whole. But this type of modeling requires a lot of data, a lot of good data. So data on kind of sectoral balance sheets and the holdings of these traded assets. And our current approach has been to use kind of lots of different sources. We haven't had a single good source. So there are some limitations to this. It's hard to ensure consistency. It also takes a lot of time to kind of organize the data. And we're trying to kind of fit the data to the model as well. So this is something where flow of funds could really be useful. Once we have kind of more granular breakdowns and things like that, this is something that would be a real use for this model. So how this might help? So there would be a single consistent data source. So I know a lot of my colleagues have spent a lot of time just kind of finding data, trying to get the data, and just it's taken up a lot of time and resource. So if we had a single consistent source, that would be hugely useful. Richer data on funding relationships, so we've got the whole kind of solid foundation of the national accounts framework and things that would really help in that respect. Also, it meant that we would also be able to kind of build the model from kind of the good data that we have, rather than kind of trying to fit the data to the model, which has been hard. We'd also look to incorporate the data on the rest of the world. So at the moment, this is very much UK focused, but consider how the rest of the world would impact the UK financial system. So again, this is something that's very important given kind of the global nature of the financial system. And finally, we'd also be able to have a consistent time series. So, we could look back to previous years and think, would things have been any different if, for example, kind of the banks had more capital like they do today and things like that? Would things have been different back in kind of 2008 and things like that? So just to summarize, this is, I guess, a key priority for the bank in terms of developing this model. It's at a fairly early stage at the moment. There will be a staff working paper coming out later this year, which will go into a lot more detail than I've been able to go into. But this is something where, again, the flow of funds and kind of more granular breakdowns of sectors and instruments would really be useful and really help our kind of risk assessment and understanding of the financial sector and how kind of all these different agents within the sector really interact. So this is something that's, something that's very important to the bank in improving our risk assessment. So yeah, thank you.
I found that fascinating, and I really do now understand how Mars can help you work, rest, and play. We've got time for some serious comments. I don't trespass too much from people's evenings, but we've got maybe 10, 15 minutes if people have questions, comments. Robert.
It's fascinating work you're doing, so I encourage you to keep going. I've got 3 questions, if that's okay. Yep. I was actually going to ask you about the rest of the world. What kind of data would you need on the rest of the world? Do you want country, currency, type of instrument, etc.? Going back to your model, just one question on it. Where would liquidity come in? Because obviously during the crisis, one of the big problems was markets actually completely seized up, so maybe there wasn't a market clearing price actually existing. It kind of came in your funding, but how would it come in? And thirdly, going back to your initial slides on the OFIs and this residual you mentioned, if I could just understand, were you saying that from the ONS figures compared with what the Bank of England estimated from its sources, there was that difference? So the ONS figures were actually larger than the Bank of England's estimates. If that was the case, why could we not reconcile the 2 sets of data?
Yes, so just taking your third question first. So in the past, the ONS number was larger than our kind of subsector kind of bottom-up approach. I think one of the reasons for that is that in this subsector bottom-up approach, we didn't have any data or series for these kind of captive financial institutions or these holding companies. So with kind of the experimental statistics have been published, that gives us data on those. I think we've still got more to do in kind of, I guess, marrying up the total number and some of the bottom-up stuff. I think it's difficult because some of our stuff is from different sources and things, and so there are consistency problems there. But that's kind of, we're making progress, but we've still got further to go on those. So on the model, I can't provide too much detail on this just because I haven't been that close to the work. But I think some of the liquidity aspects is kind of comes through partly through the funding, but also the kind of the margin calls as well. Like some of these non-banks could face significant margin calls. But I don't know whether in the actual model we have kind of a liquid asset as such. I think how we've assumed people meet margin calls is through selling the government bonds, and that they're the most liquid asset. But like I said, there'll be a working paper on this coming out shortly. And then in terms of the rest of the world, yeah, again, I'm not entirely sure on kind of what. I guess it'd probably be less about countries and more about kind of entity types within different parts.
I just wondered whether I could ask you to go back to the 0.8 trillion and the 1.2 trillion. And I think you said that the holding companies, they would be falling between the regulatory net. They wouldn't. Could you explain how it is that you've got the PRA, you've got the FSA? It's supposed to cover everything, isn't it? But
yeah, so
it isn't. And just as a sort of follow on from that, if I could ask a second one. So you've got this very complicated sounding model, which sounds very, has very good objectives. But if you have a major statistical discrepancy like that, you have to wonder about just how valuable that model is, because it's just missing out so much.
Yes, so on the holding companies, so I guess these are firms that, under the kind of the statistical classifications, they're included within the financial sector, but they're mainly holding companies for non-financial firms. So in that sense, they're not captured by the FCA, or I don't think they're regulated entities in the financial sector. In terms of kind of how the FSBs considered them in the shadow banking exercise, it generally thinks that they're not really involved in kind of credit intermediation. A lot of their exposures are mainly to other group entities. So it hasn't kind of classified them within these kind of 5 economic functions. But it is something that does need to be monitored and considered, and I think it shows the value of kind of the FSBs. So the FSB has this narrow measure, but it also looks a lot more widely, which kind of picks up like the size of these holding companies, which does allow us to kind of track them and to consider whether there is more to be done on these in future. And then in terms of the model, so I think the model is at an early stage, and we are always striving to improve data. So it is very much kind of a medium-term, longer-term project. So we're not kind of using any outputs from the model for kind of policy purposes or anything like that at the moment, but it is very much building for the future. So as we improve our data and things like that, then the model will become more and more relevant.
Hiya. My question kind of builds on Robert's point earlier about incorporating data from the rest of the world. Sorry, I'm Himanshi from ONS. And the point that I wanted to raise with rapid globalization, we are already aware that more and more financial institutions are extending operations into developing countries or countries where financial regulations are relatively meeker than what they are in the developed world. Now, how far does our current financial regulations extend to such outsourced operations into these countries?
So I think it probably depends on the activity. So there is quite a lot that we can, for banks, we can cover by kind of group supervision and kind of group capital requirements and group regulation and things. But then another way of tackling it is just through the international work, So much regulation now, the majority of it tends to happen on the international stage rather than domestically. So we've got the Financial Stability Board, and then there's kind of all various committees in Basel and things like that, which aim to kind of have consistent regulation and standards across different jurisdictions to kind of just ensure there's a level playing field, but also just kind of build resilience. So yeah, there's given kind of like you say, the global nature of the financial system, for a lot of this stuff, a lot of these sectors, it's always first best to have the policy at the global level, the international level, rather than just kind of acting domestically.
Okay. Well, I think if there's no more points or questions, that's probably a good time to close. We're just a little bit after 6 o'clock. This is one of my favourite subjects, actually. I think this is really interesting. I know I should probably get out more, but I've certainly learned a lot this afternoon. So thank you very much, first of all, Phil, for the ONS presentation. Thank you very much to Henning for what's been happening in Europe, and clearly an awful lot. And thank you also very much, Stephen, for the policy side of this, which is clearly critically important. It's very encouraging, actually, that there are clearly linkages that can be made and how this might all fit together. I found that very, very interesting and encouraging. Otherwise, let me thank the ONS team for putting this all together in a very smooth way. And let me thank you, everyone else, for coming as well and contributing. And it's been a really fascinating afternoon. So thank you very much. Have a pleasant evening.